Dakota Territory, 1872. An army surgeon rides into a Lakota camp to see a warrior who took an arrow through the thigh 2 weeks earlier, a wound the surgeon knows should have killed him. Gangrene, sepsis, amputation, that is how this story ends in his own hospital. Instead, he finds the man walking. The wound is clean, packed with a poultice of chewed plants, washed daily through a syringe made from a bladder and a hollow quill. The surgeon writes it all down with the baffled honesty of a professional. Their practice is, in some respects, in advance of our own. He had no idea how right he was. Let's begin with the tree that hid the world's most famous drug. For thousands of years, healers across North America brewed the bark of the willow for pain, fever, and swelling. Alabama, Cherokee, Iroquois, dozens of nations, same tree. The active compound in that bark is salicin. In 1897, a German chemist stabilized its derivative and called it aspirin. Nothing about the willow was luck. Native pharmacology worked by systematic trial across generations, with knowledge passed in apprenticeships that could last decades. When your laboratory is 10,000 years long, you find things. The willow was just the beginning. Now the story every history of medicine should teach. Winter, 1536. Jacques Cartier's ships are frozen into the St. Lawrence, and his crew is dying of scurvy, gums black, legs swollen, 25 men already dead. European medicine has nothing. They even autopsy a sailor and learn only what scurvy looks like from the inside. Then a local Iroquoian man named Damagea shows the French a remedy, a tea of ground evergreen needles and bark, drunk daily. Within days, dying men stand up. The needles were loaded with vitamin C, a substance Europe would not identify for almost 400 years. The French called it a miracle tree. It was simply knowledge. Wound care is where the frontier doctors kept getting embarrassed. European treatment of deep wounds into the 1700s could include boiling oil and cautery. The standard for arrow removal was often brute extraction. Native surgeons had a different toolkit: irrigation syringes of animal bladder and hollow bird bone, flushing wounds with water and herbal washes. Many of the plants used, like yarrow, now proven antimicrobial and blood staunching. They packed wounds with clean absorbent moss, drained abscesses, and understood the value some plants had in keeping wounds from festering. Result: infection rates that made army surgeons on the plains quietly take notes. They set bones like professionals, too. A fractured limb was straightened, splinted with rawhide or wood shaped to the limb, and padded, a design frontier physicians described as equal to anything in their own kits. Some healers made casts by wrapping limbs in fresh rawhide that hardened as it dried, a fiberglass cast 2 centuries early. Dislocations were reduced with practiced technique, arrows extracted by cutting down along the shaft to free the barb rather than tearing it out. None of this looks like magic. It looks like orthopedics, because that is what it was. Then there is the pharmacy itself, and the numbers are hard to believe. When the United States created its official drug list, the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, more than 200 entries traced directly to plants used by native healers. Echinacea, adopted from the Plains tribes, became one of the country's best-selling remedies. Cascara sagrada, a Pacific Northwest laxative bark, was standard in pharmacies into the 20th century. Witch hazel, learned from the peoples of the Northeast, still sits on drugstore shelves under the same name. Every one of those bottles is a footnote crediting a healer whose name nobody wrote down. Consider hygiene, because the contrast is brutal. In the same centuries when European physicians went from autopsy to childbirth without washing their hands, and doctors who suggested washing were mocked, the sweat lodge was a pillar of life across the continent. Steam, heat, scrubbing with sage or grasses, immersion in cold water after. Many nations bathed daily in rivers, to the astonishment of colonists who considered bathing dangerous. Early European accounts marvel at how clean native towns smelled compared to their own cities, where sewage ran in the streets. One side of the Atlantic had germ theory coming. The other already had the habits. Childbirth may be the strongest case of all. Native midwives favored upright birthing positions that work with gravity rather than against it, a practice modern obstetrics rediscovered centuries later. They used massage to turn poorly positioned babies, herbal teas to ease labor, and gave mothers weeks of supported recovery. Meanwhile, 18th and 19th century European hospitals were killing mothers at horrifying rates with childbed fever spread by doctors' own unwashed hands. Observers on the frontier repeatedly noted how safely native women delivered. The knowledge was there to be learned. Mostly, it wasn't. And yes, the ceremony, the songs, the medicine man in full regalia. Easy to mock, until you look closer. A healing ceremony surrounded the sick person with family, rhythm, prayer, and the absolute conviction of recovery, and modern medicine now measures what that does: reduce stress hormones, managed pain, the documented power of expectation and community on healing. Navajo ceremonies for returning warriors addressed what we now call PTSD, reintegrating the soldier into the community, an idea military psychiatry reached in the 20th century. The healers treated the body with plants and the person with meaning. We are still catching up to the second half. So why did all this brilliance nearly vanish? Because it was buried on purpose. As tribes were forced onto reservations, the healers lost access to the lands where their plants grew. Mission schools taught children that their grandparents' knowledge was superstition. And in 1883, the U.S. government went further, establishing courts that outlawed the practices of medicine men. Native ceremonies remained effectively illegal until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. Not 1878. 1978. An entire medical library, 10,000 years in the writing, was nearly burned in a single century, not because it failed, but because it belonged to the wrong people. Nearly burned, but not quite. The knowledge survived in families, in whispered apprenticeships, in ceremonies held far from the agencies. And today the world is knocking on the door it once nailed shut. Ethnobotanists work with tribal elders to document plant knowledge before it fades, pharmaceutical researchers screen traditional remedies for new compounds, and native communities are reviving healing traditions on their own terms, often insisting, this time, on credit and consent. Modern medicine brought antibiotics and surgery the old healers could not dream of. But the old healers knew things about plants, prevention, and the healing power of community that medicine is still relearning. An army surgeon in 1872 admitted the healers were ahead of him in ways he could not explain. A century and a half later, we can explain almost all of it: chemistry, antisepsis, biomechanics, psychology, discovered independently, on this continent, without a single laboratory. Next on this channel, the real story of scalping, who actually started it, and the answer points in an uncomfortable direction. And later, how Plains hunters killed 2,000-pound buffalo on foot, before the horse ever arrived. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the true history of this land keeps turning out smarter than the legend.